If we take supple leopard as an example, the first 2/3 of the book is actually about positional competency. It's about the highest expression of movement. And a lot of physios and performance people didn't understand it because they don't speak Olympic lifting. They didn't speak kettlebells. They didn't speak basic gymnastics. So they didn't understand the universal principles between the shoulder is the shoulder, the hip is the hip. If I use you for an example, you can do everything. You have a reputation for being a shoulder whisperer, but I'm like, well, he does work in professional football, and he does work with judo, he does work with track and field, and he does work. Well, it turns out the shoulder is the same shoulder joint, and the principles of that are the same. And it doesn't matter what the application is, whether it's bench press or pushing overhead. And in fact, when you get into the sport, what you realize is pretty much any sport you do, the training ends up looking very similar. The movements that we start to see are very similar. So there is a common language of position that belongs to every human being. And the only difference is how wide my stance is, right? How long my stride is, what the tempo of my, coming out of the blocks will be based on the torso length or my femur length. Not does the principle hold true, or do we have to have 1,000,001 individual principles for every person? Well, if that was true, we couldn't teach anyone any technique ever, because everyone would be so unique, right? What difference is how the sword moves based on your anthropometry, not how you move the sword or the principles of moving the sword. So one of the things we can get to is, what are the positions that you deem valuable to your athlete in your sport? How are you assessing those positions daily or weekly as part of the normal process? Because guess what? If you haven't done this for a minute, it's because you have forgotten what it's like to be an athlete. Go ahead and play in a huge match. Don't get home till 3 a.m, have sleep, show up the next day, and we're going to assess your range of motion. And guess what? I know what I know. You're going to be crap. You're going to look like an athlete who just played a huge event or a big tournament and had some stress, maybe had a newborn at home, and you tore your hamstring back in college, and I'm going to find all of that. So what we want to do is almost begin to say every day is a new snapshot of who you are. And what we're trying to do with readiness is to get back to yourself, your base position, your base competency, your base movement, your base feeling, as fast as we can every day. That's why we warm up. Well, warm up is also about making the body warm and shifting blood out and all the reasons we warm up, but it's also to reinforce skill and to bring the nervous system back online and to give athletes touch again, right? A number of conversations I've had in college where someone says something like, my coach doesn't want me to swim today, the day before the big meet. And I'm like, well, is that what your coach said? Or did she say, I don't want you to go destroy yourself in the pool the day before the match, right? If you need touch, go get in the pool. Your coach didn't say, don't touch a soccer ball or an empty barbell the day before you played. In fact, your coach would be like, please touch a soccer ball the day before you play. Let's go ahead and make sure that you feel light and funny. But you didn't play 3 hours of, touch, football before you went. So ultimately, when we ask that question, I say, well, what are your foundational movements? What are your foundational positions? Then I can step back, apply a filter, and say, well, how are you training those movements? What's your diagnostic? So what we were saying was, what positions do you value? How are you assessing those positions? Ideally, if you're a coach, you can tell how your athlete is moving and what the problem is. This is why we have batting coaches, and why some of the best batting coaches in the world are also strength and conditioning coaches. They understand what's under. So when an athlete starts to compensate, okay, here's the magic. How do I know when an athlete does not have access to his position? How do I know when an athlete cannot do what she's trying to do to express the highest expression of sprinting? Well, it turns out we know what the foot should do when it hits the ground. It should turn out to 90 degrees, and you should run like a duck, and your knee should go collapse valgus, and your arches should collapse, and you should overextend, and you should hold your breath. You should run across your butt. No, we know what all those cues are. It's called bad running form, right? Not don't run like this, you may get injured. Don't run like this because you're really slow and really ineffective runner, right? Or sprinter. And so suddenly what ends up happening is, if you're a master coach, then you can understand there's something going on. And what we've done for a generation is done a whole bunch of technique drills, or what we call skill transfer exercises or drills, to teach a skill or reinforce a skill to an athlete. And that skill could be an actual, I'm passing the ball under load and speed, or it can be, I need you to work on your foot position here. We do plenty of that, right? This is what you're planting, this is what you're cutting, this is how you're turning and sprinting. But simultaneously now, and this has happened within your generation, my generation, we can step back and say, well, I see you don't have any internal rotation of your hip. So guess what? It makes pivoting really difficult. Turning to the left, when you have to have internal rotation of the hip to turn to the left, makes turning to the left very difficult. And you're going to have to do a whole bunch of wonky things at high speed. But because your brain is beautiful, you'll solve that problem. And because you're one of the world's best athletes, you'll solve that problem. But my experience has been for the last 20 years that if I gave athletes their positional competency back, their core competency, the normative ranges, and again, improve their normal ranges, maybe they'll never chase it because they're professional sportsters who are going to always look like the pattern of their sport. But if I work to improve and restore their positions to this minimum competency where I see less compensation, then what ends up happening is the athlete uses that range and immediately is like, man, it was so much easier to go out onto the field. I remember I just did a hip opening drill, like a really terrible movement prep where I just got the hips open, we grounded around, right? And just really simple stuff on the ground. And there was this all-pro linebacker at the Saints who was like, just had a frown on his face the whole time, right? He's been there forever. He's seen everything, but he played along, right? 60 Minutes cameras are there. He's watching. It's cool. And then guess what happens? I'm in the elevator with him later on at the hotel, and he's like, my hips felt really good today. Practice was easy. Thanks. And he gives me a knuckle bump. And all I did was give him access to his native range, which made his job easier. And guess what? There's buy-in, right? And more importantly, that athlete is smart enough to say, that made me better. I don't ever have to sell that thing again. So if, again, we put the filter back on, I'm going to ask you, what are your core movements that you're training with your athletes in the gym? And every one of those things has a start position and finish position that expresses a normative range. That's why we train them. This is why coaches say things like, I like the bench press. It ties the arms to the body. Well, it turns out learning how to bench teaches you how to create a stable shoulder when the arm's in front of you, which makes you a better sprinter, for example, or a better tackler, for example, or more stable when you grab someone's gi and drop the elbow down in this short lever position because you know how to create a ton of rotation stability in that position because you benched. So what does bad benching look like? Flare, right? Elbow flare, shoulder transits forward. Well, it's easy to see that. That's crappy technique where you can't handle large loads. So suddenly we can take a step back further and say, hey, I see that you're having a difficult time practicing these movements. It's not just bigger pecs make you a better sprinter. Wouldn't that be nice, right? But that's not, coordination is just as important as the physiology. And then we can step back and say, well, what are the components to that? And what are the best ways to address that? Sometimes it's skill, right? And that's why we use skill position exercises, skill transfer exercises, technique. That's why we have all these technique coaches all over, right? The goalie has a goalie coach, the midfielders are, right? There's a defensive coach, offensive coach. But then we can sort of start to say, well, hey, if it's a positional mechanical issue, I wonder what that is. Well, it's because you don't drink water, you're hyper, you don't sleep, you're inflamed, your tissues feel like crap because you went vegan this season, right? Like all of a sudden I can really ask all of those questions, or I can say, hey, guess what? You played 90 minutes in the Olympics, and then you sat on a bus and your quads got this magical thing called stiffness because the first thing your body does is lay down a whole bunch of fascia after large loads. It doesn't build muscles after that. It builds fascia so you can handle the adaptation from the muscular development. So now you start to see, oh, look at all the tools I have to improve what? Position. If you don't understand what the principles of position are and at least know what normative range is, then how can you possibly understand compensation or what your athlete is screaming to you when she can't turn a bat or kick a ball or throw or tackle or ride a mountain bike? And suddenly, at least we can start to simplify the process. And then based on your available resources, you can start to ask, what's the best way to give this athlete her positional competency back? What are the environmental considerations that I can lay over on top of that I can control for? Sleep, hydration, nutrition, stress, right? All of those things. And then all I had to do is set you up and just say, hey, who's the best team today, right? Not who is the best compensators who had the best genetics to buffer the worst mechanics the longest. That's the problem. Because real injury is going to happen, right? You're going to get tackled.